Hello, this is the Everything History podcast with episode 62, the Epidamnian and Corcyraean Crises, 435 to 433 BCE, covering the initial two and closely connected disputes that helped to bring war to the entire Hellenic world at the close of that classical 5th century BCE.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
With the Pentakontaitia and the other extraneous background details well and truly out of the way, the plunge towards the Peloponnesian War begins. But the beginning of this plunge, a rather long plunge I must say, began not in Athens or in Sparta or anywhere near either of them. Mighty wars have a habit of starting in the boondocks of the world. History will teach you that very quickly. Concerning the Peloponnesian War, it began in earnest at Epidamnus. Now, episode 60 already addressed why war was a strong likelihood, and also addressed Thucydides' famous trap argument, so I will not bludgeon that point again, but instead the history will speak for itself and why war gradually, and then all at once, broke out in Hellas. Now, this plunge begins circa 435 BCE in the distant colony of Epidamnus. Epidamnus was in northwestern Greece along the Ionian Sea, which is just south of the Adriatic Sea. To the Greeks, however, of the classical era, Epidamnus was not actually located in Greece. They considered it part of southern Illyria. Thucydides notes that it was in foreign territory. Epidamnus was inhabited by Greeks, though, for it was the colony of the larger Greek polis of Corcyra. It must be noted, however, that Corcyra herself, which was located on an island off the coast of Epirus and just south of Epidamnus, was in fact a colony herself, a colony of Corinth. All these details are important to the political disputes in this episode, and the YouTube video for this episode shows exactly where these states are, or were, on a map. Also important for this episode is an understanding of how Greek colonization operated. To put it very simply, when Greek city-states, that is pole in the Greek, got overpopulated or felt the need to move or settle people elsewhere, they would scout out a location outside of Greece and send settlers there. In this way, the Greeks colonized a great deal of the Mediterranean and even the Black Sea, including Sicily, southern France, northern Africa, southern and central Italy, the coast of Asia Minor, and much of the coast along the Black Sea. An interesting part of this colonial method was that it wasn't really motivated by imperialism, and the new colonies owed allegiance or at least loyalty to their mother cities, and the Greek for that is metropolis. We still have that word as metropolis, although the Romans changed the original meaning of that word to mean the mother city of a specific region. Now, it was traditional for Greek colonies to be loyal to their mother city, but this faith often deteriorated over time, especially when centuries passed by. The ties of loyalty fade even quicker when the colony gains comparable or even greater strength than her original mother city, which was exactly the case between Corcyra and Corinth, for while Corinth was still commercially strong and formidable on sea, Corcyra had a greater navy as of the 430s BCE, and their strength made them rash. So, looking back on the three aforementioned city-states, Epidamnus was the colony of Corcyra, and Corcyra herself was the colony of Corinth. And that meant that Corinth actually had precedent as mother city over both Corcyra and Epidamnus. Now, in 435, there was political unrest in Epidamnus. The aristocratic party of the city were ousted by the democratic party. So the ousted aristocrats and their posse joined the Illyrian enemies of the city. With the help of the Illyrians, the aristocratic peoples began attacking Epidamnus, mainly through piracy. This was severely hampering Epidamnus, and the democratic people within the city feared how long they could resist. Therefore, they turned to their mother city, Corcyra. They sent ambassadors to ask for assistance in preserving their city. But strangely, Corcyra refused to even meet the ambassadors. This greatly upset the desperate leaders of Epidamnus, so they sent an envoy to the oracle at Delphi to ask where they ought to go or what they ought to do. The oracle told them to ask for assistance from the original mother city, that is, Corinth. The Epidamnians obeyed the word of the oracle and made public the word, or command, I suppose, of the oracle at Delphi. They made it public in order to justify their actions, lest any other Hellenic peoples think that they were going behind Corcyra's back. And the Corinthians agreed to help, and Thucydides states that a primary reason they accepted was to teach Corcyra a lesson in loyalty to the mother city, because the Corcyraeans regularly insulted Corinth. Thus Corinth armed a force of voluntary settlers and marched by land in order to avoid a sea confrontation with Corcyra to Epidamnus. And after they arrived and opened up the city from its local threats and dangers, word finally reached the Corcyraeans of all these happenings. And they were ill-pleased to say the least, although they really had no right to be. The Corcyraeans launched their active fleet, which was a whopping 25 triremes, and blockaded Epidamnus. Once there, Thucydides states that, quote, they demanded in the most threatening and abusive language, first, that the Epidamnians should reinstate the exiled aristocratic party. Secondly, they demanded that the troops and settlers from Corinth should be sent away. End quote. That is from Book 1, Chapter 26. The Epidamnians felt rightly screwed over, and they refused both demands. In response, the Corcyraeans brought in another 15 ships to make their force 40 strong and began siege operations on Epidamnus. They also allied themselves with the aristocrats and the Illyrian army outside on land. When the Corinthians received word, they quickly mustered a relief force and asked for help from their allies. They received ships from Megara, Pale, Epidaurus, Hermione, Troezen, Leucas, and Ambracia. The Thebans, Phliasians, and Elians also provided money. The Corinthians themselves gathered 30 ships and some 3,000 hoplites. In expectation, the Corcyraeans sent ambassadors to treat with the Corinthians, hoping to talk their way out of their own mess. The Corcyraean envoys demanded that the Corinthians withdraw their troops and settlers from Epidamnus. If so, they would not be harmed. The Corcyraeans also added that they were willing to arbitrate if the Corinthians did not want to abandon the city. Regarding such an arbitration, it is just easier to quote Thucydides, who wrote, quote, if they, the Corinthians, chose arbitration, the cities in the Peloponnese should be chosen by mutual agreement to act as arbitrators, and the colony should go to whichever side the arbitrators awarded it. Alternatively, the Corcyraeans proposed referring the matter to the oracle at Delphi. They urged Corinth not to start a war, saying that if she did, they themselves, through no fault of their own, would be forced in sheer self-defense to make friends elsewhere and in quarters where they had no wish to make friends. The Corinthian reply to this was that if Corcyra withdrew their fleet and the foreign army from Epidamnus, then discussion might be profitable. But it was quite absurd to talk of arbitration while the city was still being besieged. The Corcyraeans countered by saying that if the Corinthians also withdrew their forces from Epidamnus, they would do as suggested. Or, they were prepared to let both sides stay in their present positions and to arrange an armistice to remain in operation until the result of the arbitration was declared. None of these proposals was acceptable to the Corinthians. End quote. Now that was an example of crisis negotiations, but also an example of very poor negotiations, because arbitration, while it seemed like a good idea, was actually impossible, because the time for negotiations had long since passed, and the Corinthians were well aware of this. Now when did that time pass? I would say when the Corcyraeans besieged Epidamnus and the Corinthian settlers inside without having contacted or negotiated with the Corinthians beforehand. Really, if Thucydides' account is accurate, the whole crisis was horrifically managed by all parties, especially the Corcyraeans. Piss-poor politics on all accounts. This terribly managed ordeal was the beginning of the Epidamnian dispute, but I prefer to call it the Crisis of Epidamnus. Back to the history, circa 434 BCE. Corinth dismisses the Corcyraean envoys and sailed for Epidamnus, now with a fleet of some 75 ships and a land force of around 2,000 to 3,000 hoplites. By the time they arrived, however, the Corcyraeans had manned 80 ships. The two navies engaged near the Ambracian Gulf and Leucimi, a nearby island. The Corcyraeans won a serious victory, taking out 15 Corinthian ships, and on the same day forcing the unconditional surrender of the poor souls in Epidamnus. In the aftermath, the foreigners and settlers were sold into slavery, and the Corinthian citizens held as hostages. After the sea battle, the Corcyraeans executed all non-Corinthian prisoners. The Corinthians were forced to retreat to safe waters, and the Corcyraeans took advantage, laying waste to the territories held by Leucas and Elia, who, as allies if you recall, had helped the Corinthians. In the beginning of 433 BCE, the Corinthians returned and took up defensive positions at and near Actium, and the Corcyraeans took positions opposite them on Leucimi. Neither engaged, and both forces mutually retreated as winter descended in 433 BCE. Thus ended the crisis and/or dispute over Epidamnus. So far it has not involved either Athens or Sparta, but clearly there was unfinished business between Corinth and Corcyra, especially in Corinth. This led to the subsequent crisis, the Corcyraean Crisis. In this crisis, which took place almost exclusively in 433 BCE, negotiations were done quite properly this time. The involved parties seem to have learned at least a little bit from their blundering of the Epidamnian issue. Negotiations came in the fore of the crisis, and the violence came later, as politics usually works, for better or worse. Now, you could honestly lump the Corcyraean and Epidamnian crises together. Heck, this episode does that, although not on purpose, I must say. But I'm not going to bicker about such semantics. Dropping back into the history, Corinth was preparing for a continued war as winter settled in 433 BCE. Even while the ceasefire staring contest near Actium was going on during the summer, the Corinthians were busy building warships and sweet-talking their allies. In fact, to make a minor correction, the Corinthians were not interested in continuing the war with Corcyra, they were intent on escalating it. And after the rest of Hellas had heard about the debacle over Epidamnus, many Polae were willing to help Corinth. Corcyra became naturally frightened because Corinth was sure to return with a much larger fleet, yes, but they also realized that they had backed themselves into a corner because Corcyra had no allies. They had intentionally avoided allying with the Peloponnesian League and the Athenian Empire. But now Corcyra was opposed by Corinth and many of her Peloponnesian allies. Thus, out of fear, the Corcyraeans sent ambassadors to Athens in the hopes that they could join the Athenian Empire. You can see that this was going to be a big problem. Corinth, in response, also sent ambassadors to try and persuade the Athenians to stay out of the conflict. The Ecclesia of Athens heard both arguments, and Thucydides was present to record the speeches given for both sides. I will now abbreviate their speeches. The Corcyraeans went first, saying, quote, Athenians, our policy in the past now appears to have been against our own present interests. We used to think that our neutrality was a wise thing, since it prevented us from being dragged into danger by other peoples, but we now see it clearly as a lack of foresight and as a source of weakness. But now the Corinthians are coming against us with a much greater force drawn from the Peloponnese and from the rest of Hellas. We recognize that, if we have nothing but our own national resources, it is impossible for us to survive. We are therefore forced to ask for assistance, both from you and from everyone else. And it should not be held against us that now we have faced the facts and are reversing our old policy of keeping ourselves to ourselves. There is nothing sinister in our actions, we merely recognize that we have made a mistake. If you grant our request of alliance, you will not be helping aggressors, but the victims of aggression. Secondly, if you welcome our alliance at this moment, you will win our undying gratitude. For, after you, we are the greatest naval power in Hellas. In the case of war, we should obviously be useful to you, but some of you think that there is no immediate danger of war. Those who think along those lines are deceiving themselves. They do not see the facts that Sparta is frightened of you and wants war, and that Corinth is your enemy and is also influential at Sparta. Corinth has attacked us first in order to attack you afterwards. If the Corinthians say that you have no right to receive one of their colonies into your alliance, they should be told that every colony, if it is treated properly, honors its mother city, and only becomes estranged when it has been treated badly. Colonists are not sent abroad to be the slaves of those who remain behind, but are to be their equals. And it is quite clear that Corinth was in the wrong so far as we are concerned. We asked them to settle the affair of Epidamnus by arbitration, but they chose to prosecute their claims by war, instead of by a reasonable settlement. Indeed, the way in which they are treating us, their kinsmen, ought to be a warning to you and ought to prevent you from falling into their deceitful traps or listening to what may appear to be straightforward demands. It is not a breach of your treaty with Sparta if you receive us into your alliance. We are neutrals, and it is expressly written down in your treaty that any Hellenic state, which is in this condition, is free to ally itself with whichever side it chooses. What is really monstrous is the situation where Corinth can find sailors for her ships from both her allies and from the rest of Hellas, including in particular your own subjects, while we are shut off from a perfectly legitimate alliance, and indeed from getting help from anywhere. And then, on top of that, they will actually accuse you of behaving illegally if you grant our request. The whole matter can be put very shortly, and these few words will give you the gist of our whole argument why you should not abandon us. There are three considerable naval powers in Hellas: Athens, Corcyra, and Corinth. If Corinth gets control of us first, and you allow our navy to be united with hers, you will have to fight against the combined fleets of Corcyra and the Peloponnese. But if you receive us into your alliance, you will enter upon the war with our ships as well as your own. End quote. The whole speech stretches from Book 1, Chapter 32 through Chapter 36. The Corinthians then arose in the Athenian Ecclesia and responded with the following speech. Quote, These Corcyraeans have not confined their argument to the question of whether or not you should accept their alliance. They have named us as aggressors and have stated that they are the victims of an unjust war. Wisdom and moderation are the words used by Corcyra in describing her old policy of avoiding alliances. In fact, their motives were entirely evil, and there was nothing good about them at all. She wanted no alliance because her actions were wrong, and she was ashamed of calling in others to witness her own misdoings. This neutrality of theirs, which sounds so innocent, was in fact a disguise, adopted not to preserve them from having to share in the wrongdoings of others, but in order to give them a perfectly free hand to do wrong themselves. In fact, they have not acted honorably either towards us or towards anyone else. Though they were colonists of ours, they have never been loyal to us and are now at war with us. They were not sent out in the first place, they say, to be ill-treated, and we say that we did not found colonists in order to be insulted by them, but rather to retain our leadership and to be treated with proper respect. At all events, our other colonies do respect us, and indeed they treat us with great affection. It is obvious, then, that if the majority are pleased with us, Corcyra can have no good reason for being the only one that is dissatisfied, and that we are not making war unreasonably, but only as the result of exceptional provocation. As it is, their arrogance and the confidence they feel in their wealth have made them act improperly towards us on numerous occasions, and in particular with regard to Epidamnus, which belongs to us. When this place was in distress, they took no steps towards bringing it under control, but as soon as we came to relieve it, they forcibly took possession of it and still hold it. They actually say that they were prepared in the first place to submit the matter to arbitration. This phrase is meaningless when used by someone who has already stolen an advantage and makes the offer from a safe position. It should only be used when, before opening hostilities, one puts oneself on a real and not an artificial level with one's enemies. And in their case, there was no mention of this excellent idea of arbitration before they started to besiege Epidamnus. They only brought the word forward when they began to think that we were not going to let them have their own way. And now, being in the wrong themselves over Epidamnus, they have come to you and are asking you not so much for an alliance as for complicity in their crime. They are asking you to welcome them at a time when they are at war with us. What they should have done was to have approached you in the days when they were really secure, not at this present moment, when they have wronged us and when danger threatens them. And though there may be a clause in the treaty stating that any city not included in the original agreement is free to join whichever side it likes, this cannot refer to cases where the object of joining an alliance is to injure other powers. It cannot refer to a case where a city is only looking for security because it is in revolt, and where the result of accepting its alliance, if one looks at the matter dispassionately, will be not peace, but war. And this is what may well happen to you if you will not take our advice. If you join them in attacking us, we shall be forced to defend ourselves against you as well as against them. The right course, surely, is either for you to preserve a strict neutrality, or else to join us against them. At least you have a treaty of obligations towards Corinth, whereas you have never even had a peace treaty with Corcyra. At the time when Samos revolted against you, and when the Peloponnesian states were divided on the question whether or not to help them or not, we were not one of those who voted against you. On the contrary, we Corinthians openly opposed the others and said that every power should have the right to control its own allies. We say, therefore, the time has come for you to repay to us for what we did for you in the past. You were short of warships when you were fighting Aegina just before the Persian invasion. Corinth then gave you 20 ships. As a result of this act of kindness, you were able to conquer Aegina, and as the result of our other good turn to you, when we prevented the Peloponnesian states from helping Samos, you were able to punish that island. We should like you to think carefully over these points. We should like your young men to ask their elders about them. And you will find that an act of kindness done at the right moment has the power to dispel old grievances quite out of proportion to the act itself. Do not be influenced by the fact that they are offering you a great naval alliance. The power that deals fairly with its equals finds a truer security than the one which is hurried into snatching some apparent but dangerous advantage. We ourselves are now in the position that you were at the time when, during the discussions at Sparta, we laid down the principle that every power should have the right to punish its own allies. We claim that you should uphold this principle, and since our vote helped you then, you should not injure us now by voting against us. No, you should deal with us as we have dealt with you. Do not go against us by receiving these Corcyraeans into your alliance. Do not aid and abet them in their crimes. Thus you will be acting as you ought to act, and at the same time you will be making the wisest decision in your own interests." End quote. With the speeches over, the Athenians deliberated, and they argued over the decision to be made. Now, I don't know exactly who you are rooting for or biased towards, but you likely have already guessed at what the Athenians were going to decide. It's another example of politics not being fair, and it actually makes sense, honestly, because if the winner takes all in these matters of politics, then states, ambassadors, assemblies, whomever, are going to do whatever they have to do to win. There really are no rules because the rules do not apply to the victorious party, only to the losers. With that in mind, the Corinthians had the far better claim and argument, but the matter was decided before they even gave their speeches. The Athenians were going to accept the alliance offer, or offer of imperial takeover, really, because Athens was bigger than Corinth, and alone Athens could crush Corinth. Yes, it would piss off the Spartans and the other Peloponnesians, but do you really think that Athens gave a shit? No, the Athenians had a superiority complex, and they assumed war was inevitability. So, bingo! The Athenians accepted the Corcyraean offer of alliance, but to avoid breaking the treaty with Sparta and its Peloponnesian League, the agreed-upon alliance was to be a defensive alliance. This meant that if Corcyra was attacked, Athens could assist full force, vice versa too, but neither state could assist, on paper at least, in an offensive attack or a preemptive war effort. After the treaty was signed, Athens quickly sent 10 warships to bolster Corcyra. In late 433, shortly after the negotiations thereafter, the Corinthians launched a fleet of 150 ships to war against Corcyra. 60 of which had come from allied Hellenic Pole. In response, the Corcyraeans launched some 110 triremes. The Corcyraeans once more established fortifications on Leukimi, and the Corinthians set up camp at Chimerian nearby. At night, the Corinthians launched their ships and hurried towards the Corcyraeans' last known position. But as the sun crept over the water at dawn, the Corinthians espied that the Corcyraeans were already in battle formation on the sea. The Corinthians arrayed their battle line as well, such that the Corinthian ships faced the Athenian ships, as well as the right wing of the Corcyraean line. The two navies approached and eventually engaged in battle. Thucydides remarks that the engagement was more of a land battle than a sea battle, meaning that the ships got alongside each other, and the soldiers aboard started fighting hand-to-hand, shield to shield, chucking javelins at each other instead of maneuvering and ramming the ships. And that is likely because there were so many ships crammed right next to each other, so after first contact, everyone is more or less stuck, unless the ship is most nimble and expertly commanded. You can picture this well in your imagination. Over 250 ships deadlocked in the Ambracian Gulf, desperately trying to kill each other. It was chaos and very confusing, both very common elements during ancient warfare. The battle raged throughout the day, and, oddly enough, the Athenian ships were very standoffish in the fighting, at least in the beginning. Not wanting to break the treaty, the Athenian admiral, Lacedaemonius, the son of Cimon, by the way, only ordered the Athenian ships to engage when the Corinthians began to gain the upper hand. All this was on the left of the Corinthian line and the right of the Corcyraean line. Eventually, though, the Athenians fully joined in, ramming and all. And in case y'all don't know, ancient triremes were ships with sails and rowers. Very thick, large vessels. The ships had 3 levels of rowers, hence the name trireme, and depending on the construction, they could be quite nimble. They were also tipped with a ram, very thick and coated in metal plating, usually bronze. This was used for ramming other ships, of course. Now anyways, the battle's outcome began to emerge late into the day. The Corinthians proved victorious on their side of the engagement line, but the Corcyraeans had overwhelmed the Corinthian allies on the other side of the battle line. Thucydides described the battle as, quote, the biggest battle that had ever taken place between two Hellenic states, end quote. The two forces temporarily disengaged, and after the Corinthians had recovered their wounded and re-outfitted their damaged vessels, they set out again as the sun descended, trying to earn a decisive victory against the weakened Corcyraean and Athenian fleet. But as the Corinthians approached, they espied in the twilight light of the sun more Athenian ships on the horizon, 20 inbound Athenian triremes. Immediately, the Corinthians decided to backwater and retreat, disembarking back at land at their original camp. After this, the Corinthians made a retreat because they deemed further combat at this point to be detrimental given the fresh Athenian fleet on the water. Both sides claimed the victory, and both had grounds for claiming the victory, but in reality, it was largely a draw. Both sides sold hundreds of their prisoners into slavery, and they returned to their respective home harbors. The primary outcome of this Corinthian-Corcyraean naval battle in late 433 was not decisive militarily, but it was decisive politically, for now the Corinthians were again active enemies of Athens. And the peace treaty between Corinth and Athens was off because the Athenians had signed and acted on their defensive alliance with Corcyra. This violent intervention by Athens would soon turn relations between Athens and the other Peloponnesian states sour, and when news reached Sparta, the Spartans had to, I suppose, decide if Athens had broken the 30 years truce. All that is to follow in the coming episodes of the Everything History podcast.
Remember that you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and YouTube, if you so choose, that is. And you can also contact me on the podcast's Facebook page or the email address everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.